It's peaceful to be alone with your truck and the road. You don't have to deal with anyone else and you can lose yourself in your thoughts. That's how it usually is. I was driving somewhere in the middle of Nevada on a deserted highway with no real signs of life in any direction. It was one of those stretches of road where you could go for hours without seeing another vehicle, let alone a car. I've always enjoyed the solitude of trucking. Around midnight, I began to notice that something was wrong with my rig. The engine made a faint sputtering noise that was barely perceptible at first, but enough to get my attention. I looked down at the dashboard and saw nothing amiss, no warning lights, no signs of trouble, but the noise persisted, a quiet, regular cough from the engine that sounded like it was struggling. I had another 2 hours until the next truck stop, but I figured I'd get there before anything serious happened, at least that's what I believed for 20 minutes. The sputtering eventually turned into a full-on stutter, and then the engine simply died. The truck coasted to a slow stop on the side of the road, and I sat there for a while clutching the steering wheel as the engine's hum faded into nothing, leaving me in the deafening silence of the night. I had taken good care of my truck and it hadn't given me any problems before I turned the key in the hopes that it was a fluke, but the engine wouldn't turn over, so I flicked on the hazard. No matter how many times I tried to start the truck, it didn't go anywhere, so I grabbed the CB breaker 1N, lights and stepped out of the cab. The night air hit me like a wall of heat, even though it was well past sundown. Desert nights are supposed to be cool, but there was something odd about the air. I popped the hood and grabbed my flashlight from the toolbox, shining it over the engine. I'm not a mechanic, but I know enough to spot the basics. My voice echoed through the cab, anyone out there? I'm stuck on the side of the highway, rig's dead. I tried to speak a little louder this time, but all I got was static. I stood there for a minute before the silence pressed in on me. My phone didn't have a signal, and the closest town was too far to walk to. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere. I was about to get back into the cab when I noticed a pair of headlights in the distance, faint but getting closer. Perhaps it was another trucker, someone who could help or at least give me a ride to the next stop. As the vehicle got closer, I could see it was an old, run-down pickup truck. It rolled to a stop a few yards ahead of my rig, and a man stepped out. I was in a place where I had no one to call and no way to fix the truck, so I felt that unsettling tingle climb the back of my neck. Was tall and lanky, his clothes were worn, and he looked dusty as if he had been traveling for days. There was something about him that made me uneasy right away. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice low and gruff for a moment. I wasn't sure how to react, but what choice did I have? I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't afford to be picky. "Yes, my truck broke down," I said, forcing a smile. "I don't know what the problem is, it just died." The man nodded slowly, his eyes flicking toward my rig. "Mind if I take a look?" I hesitated, but what was I going to say? No, I was stuck, and this guy was the only person around, so sure, go ahead. He approached the truck with a strange, deliberate slowness, and I felt uneasy as he stood there looking under the hood with his back to me. He didn't ask any questions about the truck or seem particularly interested in the engine. Instead, he just showed me that something was wrong, that I was missing. The man stayed under the hood for longer than seemed necessary, not moving much, just standing there with his head tilted slightly as if he was listening to something. I shifted on my feet, feeling more uneasy, and asked, trying to break the silence. He didn't respond at first, just stood there motionless as a statue. However, when he finally turned to face me, he said, "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble," in a low, almost amused voice. "I understand the offer, but I think I'll just wait for someone to stop by. There's a place not far from here, just off the highway. I have some tools there, and we can tow your rig and get you fixed up." My gut was screaming at me to say no, but there was something in his voice and the way he looked at me that felt wrong, like he wasn't offering help at all, but something darker. We just stood there for a while, staring at each other in the dim light from my truck's headlights. "You sure?" he asked, taking a step closer. I knew something was seriously wrong here, but I couldn't afford to show fear just yet. I forced a smile, "Thanks for stopping," but the man's eyes were cold and calculating, as if he was weighing his options. Without saying anything else, he turned and walked back to his truck. I backed up toward the cab of my rig, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door handle, and watched as the man got into his truck, but instead of driving away, he just sat there with his engine idling. I climbed in and locked the doors, but the man's truck hadn't moved and he was still sitting there waiting. I tried to tell myself it was okay that he would leave soon, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. When the man's truck finally lurched forward and pulled up alongside my rig, my stomach twisted with dread as I saw his silhouette through the window, his face illuminated by the dim glow of his dashboard lights. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that gave me a spooky, chilling feeling. He was planning something, like he was waiting for the right moment. Minutes went by, and an hour later, the man's truck still hadn't moved. Leaned out and rolled down his window. "You sure you don't want that help, buddy?" I didn't answer because my heart was racing so much that I thought it might explode. I reached for my phone again in the vain hope that I had received a signal, but the screen remained blank. The man left his truck running and began to walk toward my door, and as he got closer, my hands fumbled for the keys in a desperate attempt to start the engine, but the truck wouldn't turn over. Panic swept through me, that same slow deliberate walk that had triggered alarms in my mind from the beginning. I grabbed the tire iron from beneath the seat and held it tightly in my shaking hands, knowing that if he tried to enter, I would have to defend myself because I had no other choice. He arrived at the door and knocked hard, saying in a low, menacing voice, "Let's have a talk." I sat there, clutching the tire iron, my pulse roaring in my ears, and he knocked again, harder this time. As he reached for the door handle, I heard the sound of another engine in the distance. Headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, and I felt a surge of hope because another truck was approaching. Its lights cut through the darkness like a beacon, and the man froze, his hand still on the door handle, his eyes narrowing as he looked over his shoulder at the approaching vehicle for a moment. These circumstances made this difficult. Though I assumed he would attempt to break in anyhow, he turned and walked back to his truck without saying anything else. He climbed in, slammed the door, and drove off into the night. The other trucker pulled up behind me. At first, I was too shaken to get out, too stunned by what had happened, but I eventually made myself go out to wave down the driver, who was a fellow long-haul trucker who was just passing through. When I told him what had happened, he offered to stay with me until a tow truck arrived, but I'm not sure how long. Passed before help eventually arrived, but the man never returned. I've been driving trucks for years, but that night was the closest I've ever been to actual danger. The man on the highway may have appeared to be offering assistance, but I now know that his intentions were anything but good, and I still keep my eyes on the road whenever I'm traveling down an empty stretch of highway. Sometimes the people who offer assistance are the ones you should be afraid of. As a long-haul truck driver, I've been on the road for almost 20 years. You get used to the solitude, long hours, and isolation that come with it. I've driven through all types of weather on roads that seem to go on forever and into towns so far away that they hardly existed on a map, but there is only one night in all those years that still haunts my nights. It was late October on a cross-country haul from Arizona to Georgia, and I had just crossed the New Mexico border when I realized I needed to stop. I had been driving for almost 11 hours straight, and my eyelids were getting heavy. You know how your brain slows down, and before you know it, you're falling asleep at the wheel. It's not safe, but I wasn't close to any large truck stops. It was just a long, empty stretch of highway with nothing in sight, so I thought I'd keep an eye out for the next rest stop and pull over there for a few hours of sleep. It wasn't ideal, but I've done it many times before, which is when I saw the sign for the rest stop 2 miles perfect. There were only 2 other trucks in the lot, both parked at the far end with dark cabs, and there were no signs of life inside the rest stop itself. There were only a few parking spaces, a couple of picnic tables, and an old, dilapidated restroom building. There were no lights other than a single flickering street lamp near the entrance, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I knew something was wrong when I slowed down as I approached the exit and pulled off the highway. Pavement. I parked my rig in the center of the lot, not too close to the other trucks nor too far away. I thought I was just being paranoid, so I turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, letting the desert silence surround me. It was eerily quiet, with no wind, crickets, or distant traffic hum. I grabbed my thermos and took a long swig of coffee in the hopes that it would dispel the spooky feeling that was creeping up my spine, but it didn't. A few minutes before going to bed, I made the decision to stretch my legs and use the restroom. I took my flashlight from the glove box and got out of the taxi. The night air was cold, and the ground crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to the restroom building. The restroom was in worse condition than I had anticipated. The door was slightly off its hinges, and the walls were covered in graffiti. I pushed open the door and entered, and as soon as I did, I smelled musty and damp, as if it hadn't been cleaned. As I was doing my business, I heard footsteps, soft at first, then louder, like someone was walking slowly around the building circling it, and froze. The rest stop had been empty when I pulled in, no other cars had arrived, and the trucks parked at the far end were still dark and silent, so who the hell was walking around? I quickly finished up and stepped out of the stall, paying close attention to the sound of footsteps. I flicked on the light switch for ages, but nothing happened. I opened the door and shone my flashlight around the lot, but there was nothing but the same eerie silence and the dim glow of the street lamp flickering in the distance. I took a deep breath to calm myself and started to head back to my truck, but the footsteps had stopped. Perhaps it was just my imagination, or perhaps it was the wind, an animal, or something else. Halfway to my rig, I noticed a man standing by one of the picnic tables. He was barely visible in the dark, with his hands stuffed in the pockets of a heavy. I was certain that he hadn't been there when I got out of my truck because I hadn't seen or heard anyone else when I pulled in. So, where had he come from? I kept my flashlight focused on him, but he didn't move. Instead, he just stood there motionless. I couldn't see his face, but something about his posture, the way he stood there as if he was waiting for something, made my skin crawl. I told myself not to show any signs of fear as I approached my truck. I looked over my shoulder and the man was still standing there, watching me. I got into the cab, locked the doors behind me, and sat there for a while with trembling hands. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a guy passing through another trucker, but why hadn't I seen him pull in and why was he just standing there? I peeked out the window, but the man was gone, so I tried to calm down and I told myself that everything was okay and that I was just tired. I lay down on the bed at the back of the cabin in the hopes of sleeping, but the anxiety I had been experiencing earlier had only gotten worse. I kept thinking about the man by the picnic table and how he had been standing there, watching me in the shadows. I turned off the interior light and lay in the cab's darkness, listening to the quiet outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. Imagine the man's silhouette standing motionless in the dark. I don't know how long I lay there, but it must have been almost an hour. I was about to fall asleep when I heard footsteps again, this time directly outside my truck. I sprang to my feet and shone my flashlight through the window, but there was nobody there, just the desert's endless blackness, the empty parking lot, and the flickering street lamp. The footsteps kept circling the truck, now slowly deliberate, and my stomach turned to twisted with fear. This was real, someone or something was out there. I listened as the footsteps stopped just outside my door, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. However, the next sound I heard wasn't footsteps, but rather a knock that was soft at first, almost courteous, like someone tapping lightly on the door. I was unable to move, so I leaned forward and tried to look through the window covertly, but I couldn't. I could only see the edge of the truck, which was illuminated by the dim street lamp, when I heard another knock from the opposite side of the cab. It sounded like someone or multiple people were tapping on the truck's side simultaneously, so I snatched up my phone and trembled as I dialed 911, but there was no signal. Knowing how remote the area was, I cursed under my breath, knowing that there was obviously no service out here, and the knocks got more aggressive. I don't know what made me do it, but I reached over and slammed my fist against the horn, the loud blare echoing through the empty rest stop for a moment. The knocking stopped, and I waited with my breath caught in my throat, listening for any sign of movement, until I heard a car. I debated getting out to try to scare them off, but something told me that was a bad idea since there were multiple people out there and they were waiting for me to make a move. As another car pulled into the lot, the engine headlights illuminated the darkness with their bright beams sweeping across the pavement and illuminating the shadows that had been lurking outside my truck. 3 figures were standing around my rig, all of them wearing dark clothing, their faces hidden by hoods. When the car's light struck them, they froze and then quickly dispersed, vanishing into the desert's darkness. I wasted no time in turning the key, starting the engine, and leaving that rest stop as quickly as possible, my heart pounding and my hands shaking as I held onto the wheel and didn't want to look back. I drove through the night without stopping until I came to a well-lit truck stop a few hours later, but even then, I didn't feel safe because I couldn't stop thinking about the people knocking on my doors. I told a few other truckers what had happened, and one of them informed me that he had heard rumors about that rest stop, indicating that it wasn't the first time something similar had occurred. People had gone missing, trucks were discovered abandoned, but there was never any. I've been a truck driver for more than 20 years, and I can tell you that I've seen some strange things out on the road. Long stretches of highway at night can play tricks on your mind. Sometimes you see shadows that aren't really there, or your tired eyes start to blur reality. You get used to the isolation, the endless miles of nothingness, but now I never stop at rest stops that remote because you never know who or what might be waiting for you in the dark, and the worst part is that I still hear those knocks occasionally. The road was as straight as an arrow, with no towns for miles, no gas stations, no rest stops, just pitch black on either side of me. Normally, I don't mind the solitude because it gives me time to think and clear my head, but that night when I was hauling a load through Texas on a remote highway that cut through miles of empty desert, something felt off. The air felt heavy, like a weight that sits on your chest and makes. I looked at my dash clock, which read 11:47 p.m., and found it difficult to breathe because my headlights were only illuminating the cracked asphalt in front of me. Even though I had a few hours left until I intended to stop for the night, I felt unsettled and not weary. When I first saw the car, it was just a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror far in the distance. I didn't think much of it because it's uncommon to see other vehicles out on roads like these at that time of night, but it's not her or maybe another trucker or someone driving cross-country. I kept an eye on it though, as it's a habit I picked up over the years knowing what's going on. Watching what's in front of you is just as important as keeping an eye on the car behind you, but after about 20 minutes, I began to get a little suspicious because I'd been driving steadily at about 65 miles per hour, and any car behind me should have caught up by now or at least gotten closer, but this one stayed exactly where it was. I tried my best to ignore the uneasiness that was growing in the pit of my stomach, telling myself that it might just be a guy who didn't want to pass. Although I was anxious about being out here by myself, I couldn't help but glance in the mirror every few minutes in the hopes that the car would accelerate or fall behind, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed there for another half hour. By then, the car had moved, my palms were perspiring, and I was unable to concentrate on the road in front of me. All I could think about were the headlights in my mirror, and my heart began to race, even though nothing significant had happened yet. No matter how many times I tried to push the fear away, it kept coming back like a cold hand gripping the back of my neck. I turned up the radio in the hopes of drowning out my thoughts, but all I could find was static. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some guy driving through the desert at night. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. I'd been through worse. I'd driven through blizzards, almost jackknifed on icy roads, and been stuck in dead zones where I couldn't get help for hours. Stations are few and far between. I turned it off and tried to concentrate on the road, but that damn car was still in my mirror. It had eyes that never blinked, and I had had enough. I decided to slow down and let the car pass me. If this guy was just playing a practical joke, I would call him out. If not, perhaps he would finally get the hint and avoid me. I lowered the gas and watched the car in the mirror, expecting it to approach, but it didn't, so I slowed down more to 50 miles per hour than 40 miles per hour. I slowed down until I was barely crawling along at 30 miles per hour, but the headlights in the distance remained fixed in the mirror, as if they were glued there. What the hell was going on? I pressed the brakes, bringing my truck to a complete stop in the middle of the road. I sat there, staring into the rearview mirror, waiting for the car to catch up, but when I looked again, it was gone. A car couldn't just vanish like that, not out here on this dead straight road with no turnoff, no exits, and nowhere to go. I must have missed something, because I threw the truck into gear and started moving faster this time. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could feel the darkness stretching out for miles behind me. I leaned forward, squinting into the mirror to see if the car had turned off or perhaps pulled over somewhere I hadn't noticed. No matter how hard I tried to explain it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I'd been driving for about 15 minutes when the headlights reappeared in my mirror, and my stomach dropped. The car was back the same distance, in the same spot, in my rear view, and it seemed as though nothing had happened. It had never disappeared at all. My hands trembled on the wheel, and I could hardly keep my grip on the wheel. I tried to remain calm and concentrate on the road ahead, but every few seconds my eyes kept going back to the mirror, watching those headlights as if they were some sort of predator stalking me. I considered pulling over at the next gas station, but there wasn't one for another 40 meters, and something told me stopping wouldn't help. I couldn't stop again, not with whatever was happening behind me, and speeding up didn't seem to help either. When the car began to move, I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things correctly, but it was approaching slowly at first, then quickly. As I watched it come closer, my heart slammed against my ribs. It wasn't swerving, its lights weren't flashing, it was coming straight at me. I floored it, speeding down the highway at 70 or 80 miles per hour, but no matter how quickly I went, the car kept catching up to me. It was like something out of a nightmare, with headlights so bright I had to squint to see the road ahead of me, and then the car was so close that I could almost see its shape in my mirrors. I couldn't think or breathe, and I knew I had to flee, but as soon as it had appeared, the car veered off into the darkness and vanished from my mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the next gas station, which was a small, dilapidated area that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1970s, but I didn't care. I pulled into the lot, jumped out of my truck, and ran inside, my legs shaking so much that I could hardly stand the attendant's gaze. After pacing for a few minutes, I told the attendant what had happened, and he simply shrugged and gave me a knowing look. He said, "You're not the first person to see something strange on that road," adding that it happens more often than you might think. Some people claim that there is a haunted car that follows drivers out there, but it never really does anything other than scare the hell out of you. I wasn't sure what to say. Haunted. I didn't want to get back on the road, but I had no other option, so I forced myself to get back in my truck and continue driving. I haven't taken that route since I avoid it like the plague because, despite my best efforts to convince myself that it was all in my head, there's a part of me that fears driving. However, I also couldn't explain what had happened either. I stayed at that gas station for an hour, long enough for my hands to steady and my heart to stop racing. I like to think of myself as someone who values practicality, working long-haul trucking for as many years as I have. You deal with things head-on, flat tires, bad weather, endless nights on empty highways, but there was one night on one stretch of road that still haunts me. I know whatever was out there that night wasn't normal, and I'm not staying to see what happens if it catches you. I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains approximately 6 years ago. I had been traveling for hours on end to run a late-night haul from North Carolina up into West Virginia. The task was straightforward enough: pick up the load, drive through the mountains, and deliver by morning. I had already completed the route a dozen times, so I wasn't anticipating anything unusual, but that night, let's just say, something was different. The weather had gotten worse earlier in the evening, and a dense fog rolled in the kind that sticks to the ground and gives you the impression that you're driving through a nightmare or a dream. My headlights cut through the fog, but the visibility was awful. I could only see a few feet in front of me. The winding road disappeared into the fog as though it was taking me somewhere I shouldn't have gone, but I persisted because I had a delivery window to meet and I wasn't going to let a little fog slow me down. I tried to concentrate on the road, but something about the silence felt oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it must have been approximately 2 in the morning because of the way the fog seemed to engulf everything around me, leaving me totally alone. I initially thought it was simply my mind playing tricks on me because long drives may cause your head to become confused and cause you to hear and see things that aren't there. It was a whisper so faint that it almost mingled with the sound of my truck's engine. Really there, but the whisper persisted, so I turned my head slightly to try to hear it. It sounded like someone was whispering right behind me, and I looked into the back of the cab, but of course, no one was there. I shook my head, telling myself that I was just tired and needed a break, but I knew deep down that it wasn't that. It was like it was inside the truck with me, lingering just behind my ears, slipping through the cracks of my sanity. I turned up the heat in the hopes that the fog outside would help me wake up a little.
was as thick as ever and I couldn't afford to let my thoughts wander, but the whisper persisted and became louder. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cold, almost angry, and my skin prickled with uneasiness. I tried to ignore the sound by concentrating on the road, but it was like trying to ignore a persistent itch that kept nagging at the back of my mind, making it impossible to think about anything else. An hour later, things started to get worse. I almost slammed on the brakes as I was rounding a sharp curve and saw movement in my rearview mirror, just a flicker of something, a shadow vanishing into the fog behind me. For a second, I thought it was an animal or another car, but when I looked again, I saw nothing, just the road stretching behind me, empty and engulfed by the fog. I took a deep breath to try to calm myself. You're seeing things, I told myself, you're tired and the fog's playing tricks on your eyes, but that explanation didn't sit well with me. The shadow had been too distinct, too human, and it wasn't just that I'd seen something, it was the prickling sensation on the back of my neck that made me feel like someone was watching me. I searched the empty road behind me, but all I saw was fog and darkness. I tightened my grip on the wheel and tried to shake off the feeling, but by 4 a.m., it hadn't gone away. When I turned around, I was a complete mess of nerves, the whispering had continued, and the shadows in my mirror had increased in frequency. Every time I turned around, I briefly saw a figure standing in the fog, observing me, but it vanished when I blinked. I was beginning to fear that I might be going insane. The fog was so thick that I could barely see past the hood of my truck. The whispering had gotten louder, almost frantic, but I was still unable to make out the words. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another shadow, but instead I saw a face. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a stop in the middle of the road, and my chest tightened. I was feeling lonely, possibly because of the late hour and the stress of my job. I whipped around expecting to see someone sitting behind me, but the back seat was empty. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my ears, trying to process what I had just witnessed. There was no way someone could have gotten in the truck without me noticing, no way they could just disappear like that, and I forced myself to look at the mirror while I struggled to catch my breath. There was a face in the back seat of my cab that was pale, expressionless, and cold. Their eyes were dark, and hollow terror gripped me, freezing me in place. Breathe, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't want to see that face again, but I had to know. I looked up at the rearview mirror, but nothing was there, just the back seat was empty as usual. Despite this, I could still feel whatever it was waiting for me in the cab, and I needed to leave. I needed to keep driving in order to put as many miles as possible between me and this cursed road. The radio crackled to life, and at first I thought it was just static, but as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't. There was a voice in the static, distorted and faint, like someone was trying to speak to me from miles away and they were saying my name. I started the truck again, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel, keeping my eyes on the road ahead and refusing to look in the mirror no matter how much I wanted to. The fog was still thick, but I didn't care, I just needed to get away from whatever had found me in the mountains. Marie, I froze. The voice was low and guttural, as if it were coming from deep within the earth. I reached for the radio to turn it off, but before I could, the voice spoke again. Marie, don't look back. I yanked my hand away from the dial because I thought I was going to pass out. The voice kept saying the same thing, louder and more desperate each time. I knew that if I looked in the mirror again, I would see something I couldn't unsee, but the voice was urging me to look in the back, daring. The voice on the radio had become louder, and now there was a cacophony of distorted sounds all screaming the same thing, so I slammed the mirror back into place and floored the gas pedal, speeding down the fog-covered road at a dangerous pace, but I didn't care because I needed to get away. My hand trembled as I reached up, brushing the edge of the mirror. I had to know I had to see slowly. I adjusted the mirror just enough to catch a glimpse of the back seat, and there it was again, just staring at me. The world outside my truck vanished into the mist, the voice on the radio crackled and sputtered, then went silent for a moment, leaving only the sound of my engine and my ragged breathing. And then all of a sudden, I felt the cold presence in the cab grow stronger as if the face was creeping closer and inching toward me. My hands were shaking so much that I could hardly control the wheel, and I had no idea where I was or if I was still on the right road. It had begun, the fog had cleared, and I continued driving for hours until I reached the next town. I pulled into a diner parking lot, my hands still shaking, and I turned off the engine. I sat there for a while trying to calm my breathing and try to convince myself that what had happened wasn't real, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was. I didn't tell anyone about it because I didn't think anyone would believe me, and there was a ghostly face in my rearview and a voice on the radio warning me not to look back. It sounded crazy even to me. I haven't driven through those mountains again, though, because no matter how much time goes by, I will never be able to forget that face or the way it stared at me. I can still hear the whisper sometimes late at night when I'm driving alone, and I never do. If these stories give you the chills, don't forget to hit the like button and share the fear with your friends. Subscribe for more terrifying stories. You won't want to stay safe out there because sometimes what's hiding in the shadows is all too real. Thank you for watching, and be careful when driving. I'll see you in the next post. Stories from the darkest corners of the road, turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Nightmare.